The security guard didn't even let him finish his sentence. Daniel Hayes, work uniform, tool bag over his shoulder, standing outside a glass-walled boardroom full of suits. He didn't belong there, and everyone in that hallway made sure he knew it. He'd been trying to reach someone, anyone. For 3 days straight, he'd flagged the same warning in the system log. 3 days of emails marked unread, calls forwarded to voicemail, a maintenance report filed and quietly ignored. So he showed up in person. The door opened. Sophia Carter, CEO, looked at him the way people look at something that wandered into the wrong room. "You don't belong here." No question, no pause, just a fact delivered cleanly, the way you'd close a tab you didn't mean to open. The guards moved toward him. Daniel didn't argue, didn't raise his voice. He just stood there for one more second and said, "Then your system will crash before end of day." The room went quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then someone laughed. Then a few others. Then Sophia turned back to her meeting like he was already gone. They escorted him out through the side exit, past the coffee station, past the receptionist who didn't look up, and back to the basement where he belonged. 7 hours and 42 minutes later, every screen in that building went dark. And the only person who knew how to fix it was already back at his workbench, waiting. The basement of Harlotech's Chicago headquarters smelled like old concrete and recycled air. Daniel had worked down here for 2 years. 2 years of fluorescent lighting, cable trays, junction boxes, and server racks, humming at a frequency that most people never heard, because most people never came down here. That was fine. He preferred it that way. He set his tool bag on the workbench, pulled up the system monitor on his secondary screen, and checked the log the same way he checked it every morning. Before coffee, before anything else. The flag was still there. Same flag. Day 4. He stared at it for a moment, then leaned back in his chair and rubbed his face with both hands. It was 6:47 a.m. His daughter Maya had asked him this morning why he looked tired. He'd told her he was just thinking. She'd handed him a piece of toast, like that would solve it. He smiled at the memory, then looked back at the screen. The flag wasn't dramatic. It never was with these things. Just a small recursive error buried inside the data routing layer. The kind of thing that looks like background noise until it isn't. Daniel had seen this pattern once before, years ago, at a different company, in a different light. He knew exactly what it meant. He knew exactly where it led. He also knew that nobody upstairs believed him. His first report had gone to the IT department head, Marcus Trell. Stanford graduate, 12 years in enterprise software. The kind of man who kept his certifications framed on his office wall. Marcus had responded within the hour, which Daniel had taken as a good sign. "Thanks for flagging. Our team reviewed and found no critical risk. We'll continue to monitor." That was day 1. Day 2, Daniel had gone deeper. He pulled the full architecture diagram, cross-referenced it with the error pattern, and wrote a 4-paragraph technical breakdown explaining exactly how the small routing fault would interact with the load increase expected during Friday's product launch. He included timestamps. He included projected failure points. He sent it to Marcus's deputy, and CC'd the facilities manager because he didn't know who else to reach. Marcus's deputy responded, "Appreciate the detail. This has been reviewed by senior engineers. System is stable." Day 3, Daniel walked upstairs. Not to the boardroom, just to the IT floor. A bright open-plan space with standing desks and beanbag chairs and a wall that said, "Move fast," built right in large sans serif letters. He asked to speak with someone from the infrastructure team. A young engineer named Priya came out to meet him in the hallway. Professional, polite, and visibly confused about why a maintenance technician was asking to look at their server architecture documentation. He explained the issue as clearly as he could. She nodded, asked 2 questions, then said she'd pass it along. He knew she wouldn't. Not because she was careless, because she was 26 years old and had been told by her team lead that the system was stable, and there was no reason for her to trust the instincts of a man in a gray work uniform over the assurances of a senior engineer with a wall full of credentials. That was the thing about hierarchies. They didn't just organize people. They organized whose words got weight. Day 4, he went to the boardroom. He wasn't proud of it. It wasn't the right move professionally, and some part of him knew it even as he was walking up the stairs. But the launch was in less than 48 hours. And if the system failed mid-demonstration in front of the investors and partners Sophia Carter had spent months courting, the damage wouldn't just be technical. It would be the kind of failure that ended careers, froze funding, and sent shockwaves through a company that Daniel, for all his invisibility, had watched function for 2 years and quietly respected. He wasn't trying to be a hero. He was trying to stop something he could already see happening in slow motion. What came next, he knew. The look, the silence, the 2 words from Sophia Carter that landed with the quiet finality of a door being closed. The guards, the side exit, the receptionist who didn't look up, and his own voice, steadier than he expected. Then your system will crash in 6 hours. He hadn't planned to say it like that. It came out more certain than he intended. But it was the truth, and he'd run out of softer ways to say it. Back in the basement, he sat at his workbench and didn't move for a long time. He thought about Maya. She was 9 years old and currently obsessed with how bridges were built, which meant their apartment was scattered with library books about engineering and little pencil sketches of suspension cables she'd done at the kitchen table. Last week she'd asked him why some bridges lasted hundreds of years and some collapsed after 20. He'd told her, usually because someone ignored a small problem for too long. She'd written that down in her notebook. He'd watched her do it, small handwriting, very serious expression, and felt something he couldn't quite name. A mix of pride and grief, and something that might have been hope. She was the reason he'd left his old job. She was the reason he'd taken this one. She was the reason he got up at 5:30 every morning and checked system logs before coffee and kept filing reports that nobody read. Not because he was trying to prove something, because he genuinely believed that the work you do quietly, without an audience, without recognition, that work was the truest measure of who you actually were. His ex-wife had called that stubbornness. His daughter called it being thorough. He called it the only way he knew how to be. At 11 a.m. he noticed the lag. It was subtle, a 0.3-second delay in data retrieval across the internal network. Most users would experience it as a slight sluggishness in their applications, the kind of thing you'd blame on your own Wi-Fi before you'd suspect a deeper infrastructure issue. But Daniel had been watching this system for 2 years. He knew its normal rhythms the way you know the sounds of your own apartment at night. This wasn't normal. He ran a quick diagnostic from his terminal. Limited access, maintenance clearance only. Not enough to see the full picture, but enough to confirm that the error he'd flagged was no longer dormant. It was moving. Slowly, quietly, the way a crack moves through concrete. Invisible on the surface, structural underneath. He could fix part of it from where he was. Not all of it. Not the root cause. But enough to slow the progression, buy a few more hours, maybe reduce the severity of what was coming. He did it anyway. Not because anyone asked him to. Not because anyone would know. He just pulled up the access points available to his clearance level, worked through the problem methodically, and patched what he could reach. The same way he would tighten a loose bolt on a staircase railing, even if it wasn't on his work order, because the alternative was knowing something was wrong and walking past. The lag reduced. The system steadied. Temporarily. He sat back and looked at the monitor. He knew what the number was. He'd recalculated it twice. About 6 hours. Maybe a little less if the load increased during the afternoon testing cycle, which it would. Upstairs, nobody had noticed the lag. Or rather, someone had noticed, filed a brief note in the IT tracking system, and the team had attributed it to a routine network fluctuation. Nothing to escalate. The launch preparation was on schedule. Sophia Carter was in back-to-back meetings. The boardroom was being set up with presentation screens and catered lunch for the investor walk through the following morning. Daniel knew all of this not because he had access to the executive calendar, but because he had been maintaining this building for 2 years. He knew which meeting rooms got booked on which days. He knew the catering company that came in for high-level events. He knew the particular quality of controlled urgency that settled over the building when something important was about to happen. Something important was about to happen. And somewhere inside the infrastructure that supported all of it, beneath the presentation slides, and the catered lunch and the glass-walled confidence of a company on the edge of a major milestone, a fault line was widening. At 1 p.m., his daughter called. She called every day after school, a habit they'd established when she first started walking home alone. He always picked up. Dad. Dad. Hey, Bug. Are you eating lunch? I'm about to. You say that every day, and then you don't. I'm eating right now, he said, and reached for the granola bar he'd forgotten about on his workbench. What are you doing? Working. Why? On what? He looked at the monitor, the steady pulse of a system quietly coming apart at the seams. Just trying to fix something, he said. Is it hard? The fixing isn't hard, he said. The hard part is getting someone to let you. There was a pause on the line, the particular pause of a 9-year-old processing something she half understood. Like when I told you the kitchen faucet was dripping, and you believed me, but Mom said it was fine. Exactly like that. And then it flooded. And then it flooded, he agreed. She was quiet for another moment. Then, you should just fix it anyway, Dad, even if they don't let you. He smiled. Working on it, Bug. At 2:30 p.m., he sent one final email. Not to Marcus, not to the IT team. He addressed it directly to Sophia Carter's office, knowing it would almost certainly be intercepted by her assistant and never reach her, but needing to try anyway. The subject line was simple. Urgent. Infrastructure failure projected before launch. Request 15 minutes. He wrote 3 sentences. The nature of the fault. The timeline. What it would cost if it wasn't addressed. He attached every report he'd filed over the past 4 days. He hit send. Then he went back to watching the monitor, tracking the slow, inevitable build of a system moving toward the edge, and waited to see if anyone, this time, would listen. They didn't. But in exactly 4 hours and 12 minutes, they wouldn't have a choice. The crash came at 6:42 p.m. Not with a bang, with a silence. One by one, the screens on the executive floor went dark. The presentation display in the main boardroom, mid-slide, mid-sentence, simply stopped. The ambient hum of servers that everyone had learned to ignore without knowing they were ignoring it, disappeared. And in its place came something worse. Nothing. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. Then everyone moved at once. Marcus Trell was the first to his feet. He had his phone out before the third screen went dark, already dialing his infrastructure lead, already composing the posture of a man who had this under control. He didn't. He just had the posture. "Get everyone on it," he said into the phone. "Now, full team." Sophia Carter stood at the head of the boardroom table and did not move. This was something Daniel would only learn about later, that while everyone else scrambled, she went still. Not frozen. Still. The way people go still when they are doing rapid, serious thinking, and cannot afford to waste energy on movement. She looked at the blank screens. She looked at Marcus. She looked at the door. And then, quietly, she said one name to her assistant. "Find me the maintenance log from the past 72 hours. The log came back in 4 minutes. Claire printed it and handed it across without comment. Sophia read it standing up, which was something she never did. She had trained herself out of the habit years ago, because standing while reading signaled urgency to everyone in the room, and she preferred to control what she signaled. She read it, standing up anyway. 4 reports. 4 days. Escalating in technical detail, de-escalating in tone. As though the person writing them had understood, progressively, that the audience wasn't going to be reached through alarm and had tried precision instead. The final report, sent to her own office at 2:30 p.m. and intercepted by her assistant as a matter of standard filtering, contained 3 sentences and 4 days of attachments and a subject line that said urgent. Infrastructure failure projected before launch. Request 15 minutes. She thought about this morning. The boardroom. The 2 words she'd said without looking at him for more than a second. She thought about the laugh that had gone around the room after he spoke, and the fact that she had not stopped it. She put the maintenance log down on the table. "How long has he worked in this building?" she asked. 2 years, Claire said. 2 years. 4 days of reports. 1 morning, handled in 40 seconds, in front of an audience. She picked up the log again and walked to the elevator. Downstairs, Daniel heard the building change. He'd been at his workbench, watching his monitor, tracking the cascade he'd known was coming. When the main server cluster finally gave, he felt it before he saw it. A shift in the electrical draw, a change in the air pressure from the cooling systems adjusting. 2 years in this basement had given him a sensitivity to this building's physiology that no diagnostic tool could replicate. He was already pulling on his work gloves when the first call came through on the maintenance line. He answered on the 3rd ring. It was Phil from the 3rd floor at desk, voice tight, trying not to sound panicked, and not quite managing it. "We need someone in the server room, sub-level 2. Now, darling. I need verbal authorization to access the production systems," Daniel said. "Not just the room, the diagnostic panels. I need someone with authority to tell me I'm cleared to touch the architecture." A pause. "What? Why are you... Just get down there." "Because 4 days ago I was told by your senior engineers that the system was stable, and I didn't know what I was talking about. If I go in there and make changes without authorization, and something goes wrong, I have no standing. Neither does the fix." He kept his voice level. "Get me Marcus Trell or someone above him. 2 minutes." 40 seconds later, Marcus Trell was on the line. His voice had the particular quality of a man who had been very confident about something for 4 days, and was now standing in the wreckage of that confidence. "Do whatever you need to do," Marcus said. "I need that in writing. Text or email, right now, timestamp." A 3-second pause. Then his phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. Authorized. Full diagnostic and remediation access. Sublevel 2 server room. M-Trell, 6:44 p.m. He picked up his bag and walked to the server room. The server room on sublevel 2 required a keycard that Daniel's clearance level technically covered for maintenance access. He swiped through, and the door opened without ceremony, the same way it always did, because no one had thought to flag the maintenance technician as someone worth locking out. The room was loud. Emergency cooling had kicked in automatically, and the fans were running at maximum capacity, trying to manage the heat load from a system that was now routing all its traffic through failing secondary pathways. It sounded like standing inside an aircraft engine. Daniel had been in here dozens of times, and he still had to remind himself to breathe normally in the noise. He moved to the central rack and pulled the diagnostic panel. The readout confirmed what he already knew. The recursive error he'd flagged on day 1 had propagated exactly as he'd predicted, through the data routing layer, into the load balancing architecture, and now bleeding into the primary server cluster in a pattern that would take the entire system offline within the next 40 minutes if left untouched. He had maybe 20 minutes to stop it from becoming permanent. He got to work. This is what Daniel Hayes did in those 20 minutes, and this is why it mattered. He didn't just patch the error. He traced it, backward, through 3 layers of architecture, to the exact point of origin. A modification buried inside a routine update package that had been pushed to the system 8 months ago. It was subtle work. The kind of thing you'd miss if you were looking for something dramatic, because it wasn't dramatic. It was a small, deliberate alteration to a data validation protocol. The kind of change that would cause no visible problems under normal load, but would cascade catastrophically under the precise conditions of a high-traffic product launch. Daniel recognized the architecture underneath the modification. He recognized it the way you recognize a paragraph you once wrote, even after someone has changed half the words. The structure was his. The logic was his. The system running Harlow Tech's entire digital infrastructure was built on a foundation he had designed 7 years ago, at a different company, in a different light. He had not known this when he took the maintenance job. Or rather, he had not known the extent of it. He'd recognized fragments in his first few weeks, the way you'd recognize your own handwriting on a page you don't remember writing. He'd confirmed Caldwell's connection to Harlow Tech approximately 6 months in, and he had sat with that knowledge in the way you sit with something that doesn't have a clean answer. He had considered leaving. He had considered reporting it, to whom he wasn't sure, since the information was circumstantial, and the history between him and Caldwell was exactly the kind of thing that made circumstantial information look like a vendetta. He had considered doing nothing, which felt wrong, and doing something, which felt dangerous, and had arrived at a position he wasn't proud of. Staying watching and telling himself that an architecture flaw without evidence of intent was not the same as an architecture flaw with it. He had been waiting, without quite admitting he was waiting, for the thing that would make it legible. For the moment when what he suspected became something a room full of people could actually look at. Tonight had been that moment. He was aware that this calculation had cost something. That 6 months of watching had meant 6 months of a modification sitting in a live production system, and that a different choice might have shortened that window. He didn't have a clean answer for that. He suspected he wouldn't, for a long time. That was a problem for after the system was fixed. Right now, the problem was the modification. He isolated it, documented it, screenshotted the exact code block, time-stamped, flagged to his own personal log on the maintenance system, where it would sit with metadata showing exactly when it was accessed and by whom. Then, he made a decision. He could patch around it, write a workaround that stabilized the system without touching the modification itself, preserve whatever arrangement had led someone to put it there, and walk away with the system running, and his head down, and his name out of everything. Or he could remove it. The modification was the root cause. Patching around it was a temporary fix. 6 months, maybe a year before it caused another failure, probably a worse one. Removing it was the correct solution, technically. It was also the correct solution every other way he could think about it. He removed it. The process took 11 minutes. When it was done, he ran a full diagnostic, watched the routing pathways re-establish themselves in the correct configuration, and listened to the server room begin to quiet. Fans stepping down from emergency speed. The particular hum of a system finding its equilibrium again. It sounded, he thought, like something that had been holding its breath finally exhaling. He packed up his tools, closed the diagnostic panel, and pulled out his phone to document everything in the maintenance log. He was halfway through typing when the server room door opened. He had documented the modification before removing it, screenshotted the exact code block, timestamped, saved to 3 separate locations, including his personal encrypted drive and the maintenance system's immutable log, which recorded not just what was filed, but exactly when and by whom. He had taken photographs of the diagnostic readout at each stage of the process. He had written a plain language summary of what the modification did, how he had identified it, and why he had determined that removal rather than a workaround was the correct remediation. He had done all of this before touching it. Not because he was covering himself, though he was, and he knew it, and he wasn't ashamed of knowing it, but because the modification itself was evidence of something, and evidence needed a chain of custody, and he was not going to be the person who fixed a crime scene without documenting what the crime scene looked like first. When he removed it, he logged that too. Exact timestamp. Exact method. The before and after state of every affected pathway. The kind of documentation that would mean something in a room with lawyers in it. He had a feeling there would be a room with lawyers in it. Sophia Carter walked in alone. She looked different from this morning. Not less composed. More. The kind of composure that comes not from confidence, but from decision. She had made up her mind about something, and it showed in the way she moved through the server room, without hesitating, without looking at anything except him. She stopped a few feet away. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The servers hummed between them. "It's fixed," Daniel said. "Not a quick question, not a boast, just information." "I know." She paused. "I've been watching the readout from upstairs for the past 12 minutes. Marcus Trell gave you authorization." "By text. I have it timestamped." She nodded once. Not surprised. More like confirming something she'd already suspected. "You asked for it in writing before you went in." "Yes." "Most people in a crisis don't think to do that." "Most people in a crisis haven't had their judgment questioned for 4 straight days," he said. It wasn't bitterness, just accuracy. He nodded and went back to typing his log. "I read your reports," she said. He didn't stop typing. "Which ones?" "All 4 of them." Another pause. "And the one from 7 years ago. The one you filed at Mercer Systems before they terminated your contract." His hand slowed on the phone screen. He finished the sentence he was typing, then looked up. Her expression was difficult to read. Not cold. He'd thought it was cold this morning, but he understood now that it was something more complex than that. It was the face of someone who had built a system of judgment she trusted completely, and was now holding a piece of evidence that didn't fit inside it. "You knew about the modification," she said. "I found it tonight." "But you suspected something like it. That's what you were flagging." "I flagged a symptom," he said. I didn't know what was causing it until I was inside the system." She was quiet for a moment. "The modification came from Caldwell Partners, our infrastructure consulting firm. The update was pushed 8 months ago as part of a routine optimization package." She said this carefully, precisely, like someone reading from a document. "Raymond Caldwell signed off on it personally." Daniel said nothing. "You worked at Mercer Systems 7 years ago," she continued. "Raymond Caldwell was Chief Technology Officer at Mercer Systems. He terminated your contract after you refused to approve a system update that you flagged as structurally unsound." "That's correct. The update you refused to approve." She stopped. Started again. "Was it similar to this one?" He looked at her steadily. "It was the same class of error. Different system, same approach. Bury a fault in a routine package. Push it through during a low scrutiny window. Let it sit. And when it fails, the company loses data, loses contracts, loses confidence." He paused. "And the consulting firm that built the replacement infrastructure gets the emergency contract." The server room was very quiet. Sophia stood there, and Daniel watched something move through her expression. Not shock exactly, because he suspected she was not easily shocked. More like the particular discomfort of a person who prided themselves on seeing clearly, confronting the evidence that they had been looking in the wrong direction. "He told the board you were terminated for cause," she said finally. "Incompetence and insubordination." "I know what he told them." "You've known he was connected to this company?" "I found out about 6 months after I started. I thought about leaving." He looked around the server room. The racks, the cables, the diagnostic panel. He'd opened 100 times. "I needed the job." She absorbed this in silence. "Then, why didn't you say anything? When you were flagging the errors, why not say you recognized the architecture? Why not tell someone you had history with Caldwell?" It was a fair question. He'd asked himself the same one, in different forms, over the past 4 days. "Because the moment I brought personal history into it," he said, "it becomes a grievance. A disgruntled employee with an axe to grind. The technical problem disappears, and the interpersonal problem takes its place." He shook his head slightly. "I needed someone to look at the data, not at me." She was quiet for a long moment. "Nobody looked at the data," she said. No. I didn't look at the data." He didn't answer that. It didn't need an answer. She left after another few minutes, saying very little else. He finished his documentation, checked the system readout one final time, and walked back to his workbench in the basement. He sat down. He thought about Maya, who was at a neighbor's apartment tonight, because he'd known it was going to be a long evening. He thought about the bridges she drew at the kitchen table, suspension cables, load-bearing arches, the elegant arithmetic of weight and tension. He thought about the moment in the server room when he'd made the choice to remove the modification instead of patch around it. It had taken maybe 3 seconds to decide. It hadn't felt difficult. It had felt, in that strange way that real decisions sometimes do, almost inevitable. Like the only path that was actually a path, and everything else was just the illusion of one. He didn't know what came next. He suspected that by morning, a great deal of Sophia Carter's understanding of the past 8 months would have restructured itself around the things she'd learned tonight. He suspected that Raymond Caldwell's name would appear in some difficult conversations very soon. He suspected that someone, eventually, would come back to this basement with questions or an offer, or both. He didn't know how he'd answer. He packed his bag, turned off his monitor, and walked to the exit. In the stairwell, his phone buzzed. "Maya, did you fix it, Dad?" He typed back, "Yeah, bug? It's fixed." 3 seconds later, I knew you would." He stood there in the stairwell for a moment, holding the phone, reading those 4 words. Then he pushed open the door and walked out into the night. Behind him, every screen in the building glowed quietly back to life. The call came at 7:14 a.m. Daniel was making breakfast when his phone rang. Scrambled eggs. Maya sitting across from him at the kitchen table with a library book open beside her bowl of cereal, one hand holding a spoon, the other tracing the curve of a cable-stayed bridge with her finger like she was memorizing. The number was unfamiliar. He almost didn't answer. "Mr. Hayes." A woman's voice. Efficient. Precise. "This is Claire Ashworth, Executive Assistant to Sophia Carter. Ms. Carter would like to meet with you this morning at 9 o'clock. The executive conference room on the 14th floor." He looked at Maya, who had not looked up from her book. "I'll be there," he said. He dropped Maya at school early, stood outside the gate for a moment, after she disappeared through the doors. Backpack too big for her, walking fast, already thinking about something, and then took the train downtown. He wore the same work uniform he always wore. He thought about not wearing it, then thought about why he'd thought about not wearing it, and decided the thinking was the problem. He was who he was. That hadn't changed overnight. The 14th floor looked different at 9 in the morning than it did during a crisis. Quieter, more deliberate. The kind of environment that had been carefully designed to signal that serious, important work happened here. Clean lines, expensive materials, the muted confidence of money that no longer needed to announce itself. Claire Ashworth met him at the elevator and walked him to the conference room without small talk, which he appreciated. Sophia was already there. So was someone he didn't recognize, a woman in her 50s, silver-haired, sitting with a legal pad and the particular stillness of someone paid to observe. And so was Raymond Caldwell. Daniel had not seen Raymond Caldwell in 7 years, but the man looked almost exactly the same. Slightly heavier. Silver at the temples now, where there had been gray before. The same way of sitting, slightly forward, hands loosely clasped, the posture of a man perpetually positioned to take control of a room. He looked at Daniel with an expression so carefully neutral, it was almost its own kind of statement. Daniel sat down across from him and said nothing. Sophia spoke first. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Hayes." She had a folder open in front of her. Daniel could see his own reports in it, printed, annotated in the margins with small, precise handwriting. "I want to be direct about why we're here." "Please," Daniel said. "Last night, you restored our system approximately 37 minutes before it would have caused irreversible data loss across our entire client infrastructure. You also removed a code modification that our forensic team confirmed this morning was deliberately embedded in a routine update package 8 months ago." She paused. That modification originated from Caldwell Partners. Caldwell shifted slightly in his chair. "Sophia, I think we should be careful about the language we use before we have a complete." Ray Deshuet. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "I'm going to ask you to let me finish." He stopped. She looked back at Daniel. The modification was designed to create a failure condition under high traffic load. Our forensic team's assessment is that it was not accidental. The structure of the code suggests deliberate authorship. She closed the folder. Raymond Caldwell was the authorizing executive on every update package Caldwell Partners submitted to us over the past 18 months. The room was very quiet. Daniel looked at Caldwell. Caldwell was looking at the table. "Mr. Hayes," Sophia continued, "I'd like you to walk me through what you found. In your own words, in your own order. Take as long as you need." He talked for 40 minutes. He started with day 1, the flag in the system log, the email to Marcus Trell, the response that arrived within an hour and said everything was fine. He walked through each subsequent day methodically. The technical breakdown he'd written on day 2, the conversation with the engineer named Priya on the ET floor, the decision to go to the boardroom on day 4. He talked about the moment in the server room when he'd isolated the modification, when he'd recognized the architecture beneath it as his own, like finding your handwriting on a page you didn't remember writing. He explained what the modification did, how it worked, why it would have been invisible under normal conditions and catastrophic under the precise load profile of a product launch. He talked about Mercer Systems. He said it plainly, without performance, that he had designed the foundational architecture that Harlow Tech System was built on, that Raymond Caldwell had been PTO at Mercer when he'd refused to approve a structurally similar modification 7 years ago, that Caldwell had terminated his contract the following week, and the paperwork had cited incompetence and insubordination. He said that he had discovered Caldwell's connection to Harlow Tech approximately 6 months into his maintenance job and had considered leaving, and had stayed because he needed the work. He said that he had not flagged the personal history in his reports because he knew it would reframe a technical problem as a personal grievance, and that the technical problem was real and needed to be seen on its own terms. When he finished, the silver-haired woman with the legal pad had filled 3 pages. Sophia sat quietly for a moment. Then she looked at Caldwell. Ray, Nui, shh. Caldwell had been still for a long time. Now he looked up, and Daniel saw something in his face that he hadn't expected. Not defiance, not the aggressive neutrality he'd maintained at the start of the meeting. Something more like exhaustion, like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and could feel the weight becoming impossible. "I want to speak with my attorney," Caldwell said. "That's your right," Sophia said. "Claire will show you to a room." He stood, straightened his jacket, and walked to the door without looking at Daniel. He stopped with his hand on the handle, stood there for a moment, not dramatically, just the stillness of a man arriving at the end of something. He didn't speak. He didn't turn around. Then he opened the door and left. The general counsel made a note on her legal pad. The room was quiet. Daniel looked at the empty chair where Caldwell had been sitting. He had spent 7 years with a version of this moment in his head. What he might say, what Caldwell might say, how it would feel to be in the same room again, with the thing between them finally visible. The version in his head had involved more words, more resolution. What he felt, watching a tired man walk out of a conference room to call his lawyer, was something quieter and less satisfying than the version in his head. Not closure exactly. More like the end of a question he'd been carrying, not answered, but put down. That would have to be enough. The room was quiet after he left. The silver-haired woman, who Daniel now understood was Harlow Tech's general counsel, turned a page on her legal pad and continued writing. Sophia looked at Daniel. "I owe you an apology," she said. "Several, actually, but I'll start with yesterday morning. You don't have..." "I do." She said it without self-flagellation, without the kind of excessive contrition that was really just another performance. She said it the way she said everything, clearly, directly, like someone who had decided on something and was stating it as a fact. "I dismissed you without hearing you. I made a judgment based on how you were presenting rather than what you were saying. That was a mistake, and it nearly cost this company everything." She paused. "More than that, it was unfair to you, and that matters regardless of what it cost the company." Daniel looked at her for a moment. "I appreciate that," he said, and he meant it. The offer came at the end of the meeting. She slid a single sheet of paper across the table. He looked at it without picking it up. The title at the top read Chief Technology Officer, Harlow Technologies. "You built the foundation this company runs on," Sophia said. "You understand it better than anyone here. And last night you demonstrated a quality of judgment that I've spent 5 years trying to build into my leadership team, and largely failed." She paused. "I want you in this building, not in the basement." Daniel looked at the paper. He looked at it for longer than he intended to. Not because he was uncertain about the answer. The answer had formed clearly, almost immediately, in the way that answers do when they come from somewhere deeper than calculation. But because there was a number implied by that title, and he knew roughly what that number was, and he had a daughter and a pull-out couch and brake pads that still needed replacing, and the part of him that had been running the arithmetic of tight margins for 4 years did not make it easy to slide a piece of paper back across a desk. He let that part have its 30 seconds. Then he slid the paper back. "No," he said. Something moved through her expression. Surprise, recalibration. "Can I ask why?" He thought about how to say it, not because he wasn't sure, but because he wanted to say it accurately. "I'm not a systems manager," he said finally. "I never was. I'm good at understanding how things work and seeing where they're failing. But running a technology division, the politics, the stakeholder management, the board presentations, that's not what I do well. And I'd be doing you a disservice if I took the title and spent the next 2 years proving." He looked at her steadily. "You need someone who's good at that job. I can help you find them if you want. I can tell you what to look for in the technical foundations. But I'm not the person who's sitting in that office." She studied him for a moment. "Most people in your position would take the offer." "I know. You understand that refusing it doesn't obligate me to anything else." "I know that too." She was quiet for a long moment. Then carefully, "What do you want, Mr. Hayes? Not what you're owed. What do you actually want?" It was the right question. He'd been sitting with the answer to it for longer than she knew. "I want to finish what I started," he said. "Not here." He paused. "My daughter asked me once why some bridges last hundreds of years and some fall apart after 20. I told her it's because someone ignored a small problem for too long." He looked at his hands on the table. The hands of a man who fixed things for a living, who'd spent 2 years in a basement being ignored, who'd just saved a company that had never learned his last name. There are kids in this city who are going to spend their whole lives being told they don't belong in rooms where decisions get made. Because they don't have the right credentials, the right background, the right way of presenting themselves. And some of them understand systems better than anyone in those rooms will ever give them credit. He stopped. "I want to teach them, not just to code, to see, to understand how things actually work underneath the surface." The room was quiet. The general counsel had stopped writing. Sophia looked at him, and this time, her expression was legible in a way it hadn't been since he'd met her. Not soft exactly, but open, the look of a person encountering something that didn't fit the categories she'd brought to the meeting, and deciding the categories were the problem. "How much would that cost to do properly?" she said. He hadn't prepared for this question either. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I'd have to think about it." "Think about it," she said, "and come back to me with a number." He called Maya from the elevator. She picked up on the second ring, slightly breathless, which meant she'd just come in from recess. "Dad, how did the meeting go?" "It went okay." "Did they apologize?" He smiled. "Yeah, they apologized." "Did you get a promotion?" "No." "Why not?" "Because I told them I didn't want one." A pause, long enough that he could picture her expression, The particular look she got when she was deciding whether something made sense or just seemed like it didn't. Is that because you have a better idea? Yeah, bug, he said. I think I do. Okay, she said, satisfied, like this was the expected answer. Are you coming to pick me up? 3:30, same as always. Can we look at the new library book tonight? It's about aqueducts. Absolutely. Okay. Bye, Dad. Bye, Bug. The program opened 8 months later in a converted warehouse space on the south side of Chicago, donated, after a negotiation that Sophia conducted personally, by a property development group that owed Harlow Tech a significant favor. They called it Groundwork. Not Daniel's idea for the name, actually. Maya's. She'd spent 20 minutes at the kitchen table one evening listing options in her notebook, reading them aloud, crossing them out, and then looked up and said groundwork like it was obvious, because it was. You build from the ground. You understand what's underneath before you build anything on top. That's not just engineering, she explained, with the certainty of a 9-year-old who had recently read extensively about aqueducts. That's everything. He couldn't argue with that. On the first day of the first session, 23 kids sat in folding chairs in the warehouse space, ages 10 to 15, from 6 different schools across the south and west sides. Some had been sent by teachers. Some had followed a flyer. One had found the program's basic website, designed by a volunteer, functional in the way things are functional, when someone who knows what they're doing builds them without resources, and emailed to ask if she could come. Daniel stood at the front of the room and looked at them. He thought about himself at their age. He thought about the version of him that had learned to see systems as a teenager because he had no one to teach him directly. Had simply looked at things, taken them apart in his mind, put them back together, and discovered slowly that this was something he was good at. He thought about how different his life might have looked if someone had pointed at that ability early and said, "This is real. This matters. This is worth building on." He thought about Raymond Caldwell, not with bitterness, which surprised him, but with something closer to clarity, about how hierarchies organized whose words got weight, and how a man who understood that had used it as a weapon, and how the answer to a weapon like that was not a better weapon, but a longer game. He looked at the 23 kids in the folding chairs. "I'm going to teach you how to see," he said. "Not just how to code, not just how systems work, but how to look at something complicated and understand what's actually holding it together, and what's about to break." He paused. "That's a skill that belongs in every room where decisions get made. The only reason it isn't there is because nobody brought it in." He looked along the rows of faces. Skeptical, curious, carefully neutral, openly interested. "We're going to fix that." Sophia came to visit 6 months after Groundwork opened. She came alone, no assistant, no advance notice, just showed up on a Tuesday afternoon while a session was running. Daniel was at the back of the room watching a 15-year-old named Jerome explain to a group of younger kids why a bridge fails not at its strongest point, but at the place where 2 different materials meet and handle stress differently. Sophia stood beside Daniel and watched Jerome for a while. "He's good," she said quietly. "He's exceptional," Daniel said. "He thought in systems before he had language for it. Now, he has language." She nodded slowly. They stood there in comfortable silence while Jerome fielded questions with the patience of someone who genuinely wanted the other person to understand, not just to be impressed. "I've been thinking about something you said," Sophia said eventually, "in the conference room, that the moment you brought personal history into it, it becomes a grievance instead of a problem." She paused. "I do that. I've been doing it for years. Categorize people by how they present. Make decisions about what they're saying based on where they're saying it from. He didn't respond immediately. Not because he disagreed, but because she didn't need him to confirm it. She was thinking out loud, and interrupting that would have been the wrong thing to do. "I'm trying to change the evaluation criteria," she said. "It's slower than I expected. People who've built careers on a system don't dismantle it easily, even when they can see why they should." "No," he agreed. "They don't." "How do you do it with them?" She nodded toward the room. "How do you get them to see differently?" He thought about Jerome, and Maya's notebook, and the question about bridges. "I start with something they can touch," he said. "Something physical, something real. Show them how it works, where it's strong, where it's vulnerable. And then I say, everything operates this way. Companies, institutions, communities. Every system has load-bearing points and weak connections, and the places where two different materials meet and don't quite fit." He looked at the room. "Once you see it that way, you can't stop seeing it." She was quiet for a moment. "I'd like to bring some of my leadership team here," she said. "If you'd allow it. Not as charity, not as a photo opportunity, as student." He looked at her. "Same rules as everyone else," he said. "They sit in the folding chairs." Something shifted in her expression. Amusement, maybe, or recognition. "Same rules as everyone else," she agreed. "Then, your system will crash in." That evening, he picked Maya up from a friend's house. She got in the car and asked him 2 questions in rapid succession. How the meeting went, and whether they could stop for noodles on the way home. He said it went okay, and yes to the noodles. She accepted this and opened her library book. He drove. At a red light, he glanced at her in the rear-view mirror, head down, finger tracing something on the page, entirely absorbed. He didn't know yet exactly what groundwork would look like, what it would require, whether it would work. He had a conversation to prepare for, and a number to think through, and a lot of things that were still unresolved. What he knew was that the question Maya had asked him about bridges, why some last and some don't, had an answer that extended further than engineering. It extended into every system where someone understood what was holding things up, and nobody thought to ask them. He was going to spend some time in that extension. The light changed. He drove them home.